Oedipus's story at Thebes is rooted in a family with close connections to the land. Yes, indeed. We've seen, or I mentioned earlier in one of our lectures, the connection of this figure, Cadmus, in Oedipus's own background. The founding families of Thebes, it was told, emerged when Cadmus was he was on a journey from his background and from his ancestral home in Phoenicia, and comes to the place of Thebes, and there's a serpent on that's wound itself around a spring and is now threatening people who try to get there. Cadmus is powerful and strong, slays the serpent, takes the serpent's teeth and throws them into the ground. Well, from these teeth sprout up out of the ground itself grand heroes that are armed. They have this massive battle, fight one another in this archetypal act of fratricide. 5 of them survive and they become the founding families of Thebes. This is the story. This is where the Thebans understand themselves to come from. Or at least this is where the Athenians understand the Thebans to come from. Remember, these are Athenian-based tragedies that we see. So these 5 men survive, become the founding families of Thebes, and introduce us to another in our installment of universal laws. Remember, we're saying universal with a tongue in our cheek, just a little bit. Universal law number 7. A deep connection to the land is a common human expression. Humans love to claim deep connections to the land. There is an aristocratic dimension to this that shows up in Greek materials, and I'm familiar with it with some aristocrats in my own experience. People who claim they are a 7th generation Bostonian or a 19th generation Floridian, or whatever it happens to be. People get great pride in claiming to have been connected to the land. I think that there is some residual sense of back in a feudal society, the idea that this land just kind of came to you and it belongs to you in some sense. The idea of being dislocated and wandering, such as Odysseus embraces, is also a little bit disconcerting. And to think that you have an actual rooted connection to a land is a nice thing to have. Well, the Greeks surely thought that, and in the stories like we see in the founding families of Thebes, there's a strong connection to the land. In fact, the idea shows up in this idea of birth from the land itself. There's a Greek term for this called autochthony, meaning from the ground itself. Remember, chthonic is a term we've already run into, talking about earth-based things, and auto added in front of that means the earth itself. So autochthony is a theory that people were born from the earth, from the earth itself. This expresses a deep connection to the land. Of course, you were born from it. It's your own womb. I mean, you came up out of it. You're sort of emerged there like a plant belonging to it. Stories of autochthonous birth are common in ancient myth. We have connections to the earth, and great heroes in the past, there are hints that they have these connections. When people do have autochthonous connection to the land, they also are going to have some defect in the foot. This is typically associated with ideas of autochthony. The claim is then that if you grow up like a plant out of the ground and you sort of pop up, at some point someone has to pick you. So they pluck you out of the earth, and when they do, your feet get misfigured somehow in one way or another. We have this in, you'll recall, Achilles has his heel. This is probably connected with that background. He's got a weak spot at his lower extremities and his heel. Jason, a famous hero from on the Greek side of things, famously loses a sandal early on in his adventures. Suggestion there's a connection with autochthony. Feet are typically a site of vulnerability in Homer. We see this in the case of Hector. Achilles uses Hector's feet as a kind of handle to drag him around. Lameness shows up in other, lameness of the feet shows up in other lineages of grand heroes where we think autochthony is being hinted at. Whether it all coheres together in a single picture is another question. In the case of Oedipus, it seems clearly to be something that's going on. Oedipus's name. Recall that when we look at what the background of a Greek hero is, we've got to address what the name is. We hear in Oedipus's own story that his background, in Greek, his name is pretty closely linked to the Greek terms for swollenness, oideo, there, a Greek term meaning to swell, plus pous, foot. So Oedipus is he of swollen foot. Now, in his case, of course, there are multiple reasons why his foot is swollen. His father, after all, cuts right through his poor little infant tendons and binds him together at his ankles, so he has vulnerability there. But there is a further connection to this autochthonous background that's being hinted at in talking about Oedipus's own lameness of his feet. The feet come up in several places in Oedipus's story, and let's just pull out a few of these to have a look at them. Creon talks about line 130, the riddling Sphinx induced us to neglect the mysterious crimes and rather seek solution of troubles at our feet. Something right in front of them, yes, that seems to be what he's saying, but also there's a bit of a trouble when we get to Oedipus with his feet. That's a riddle that needs solving. Why is it that there's this terrible scar there? Tiresias 4:17 talks about a deadly-footed, double-striking curse from father and mother both shall drive you forth. Oedipus's curse is there connected with his feet through Tiresias, this prophet who has Apollo's own insight. Jocasta, King Laius pierced his ankles, and by the hands of others cast him forth. So we've got the mention of the pinioning of the ankles of Oedipus. Oedipus then jumps in, talking about going on foot. I was encountered by a herald and a carriage with a man in it, recounting his own version of the event where Laius gets killed. He is on foot at the time. There is something, there's a connection there with Oedipus's rootedness in his foot-based identity. And the messenger jumps in as he's telling Oedipus his own background. I loosed you. The tendons of your feet were pierced and fettered, so that from this you're called by your present name, Oedipus of the swollen foot. Each of these points in the story links us back to Oedipus's foot defect, and the foot defect typically in mythology is tied to a background of autochthonous birth, a pure connection to the land. So what Sophocles has done extremely skillfully in tying these two things together is to take some piece of Oedipus's past that is a purposeful intervention by his father in order to try to kill him, in other words, the misfiguring of his feet, and link it to another way of talking about Oedipus's own background. That misfiguring of the feet, yes, can be emblematic of the father's attempt to kill him and brush him aside, or it can be emblematic of Oedipus's own connection to Chthairon, his own special rebirth and ability to overcome the problems in his own life. He now is going to belong in a special way to this land. This earth-born connection is going to give him a certain kind of rootedness that despite his own father's attempts to erase his connection to Oedipus, Oedipus is still going to survive and come and grow on from those. In fact, if his father had not tried to ostracize him, put him out for lost on the hillside, Oedipus would not have been reborn and had this special connection to Chthairon. Now, the connection has there's a sadness to it, in addition to a sense of rebirth from the womb of Chthairon, in the sense that he is now from nowhere. He's literally from a trackless hillside. He doesn't belong to people anymore. He's a singleton grown out of the earth. What's his background? What's his connection? What's his name? What do all these things do for him? None of them leads back to anything of linkage. Instead, the only thing that has ground truth, so to speak, for Oedipus anymore is this autochthonous connection to Chthairon. Giving us this iteration of a deep connectedness has a sad kind of pathetic quality to it. All that Oedipus has left is this barren wasteland and the idea that he's abandoned. Autochthonous birth has, in some sense, though, always this sense of removing a person from genetic lineage, from genealogy. Where did you come from? Well, who knows what people were in my background? I came from the land itself. That fantasy of not having any lineage, any parents, to just sort of have emerged up out of nothingness has a certain appeal for people with very complex family backgrounds. There's a kind of ultimate escapism, I think, built into this idea of Oedipus that, yes, indeed, Chthairon is my background. His family connections are so messed up and compromised, he turns his back on them and now claims a special linkage only to that hill. Eventually, all of this, though, the attempt to turn back on things and claim a connection to a land gets very complicated and suggests, in Sophocles' own way, I think, the complexity of humans' claim to deep connection with the land, and instead, I think, underwrites, or at least keeps in front of us, the idea that we as humans are mostly just pretty much always going to be wanderers. What connection to the land do we have? Well, we're sort of stuck with connections to each other. The only way to get away from that is to become an escapist in Oedipus's horrible, horrible reality.